So Duncan was born in Greenock, is it? Is that how you pronounce it?
Greenock, yes.
Greenock in Scotland in 1949. He attended St Mary's University, Strawberry Hill, and King's College, London. He was a member of the Poets' Workshop, which ran through the 60s to the 90s, where his mentors were, among others, Philip Hobsbaum, George MacBeth, Leonard Clark, Peter Porter, and Alan Brownjohn. Duncan began publishing in journals in the 70s and lived and worked in Geneva and Bern, commuting between his British and Swiss workshops until he moved to Bath. He toured Australia, read at the Melbourne Festival, and was a prize winner at the Wells Literary Festival. The workshop, 1984, celebrated its 25th anniversary with an anthology, Divers, which he published in his first collection, Consolations, in December 2010. Duncan's poems have appeared in the summer edition of the Salzburg Review and a short story in the collection Jigsaw, published in Bern. He is a Poetry and Poets' Voice co-convener at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. His interest in Hamlet began when the English teacher at his school walked out over difficulties she had over the school production. He was asked to write the school play and did so with the Hamlet affair, which ran to packed audiences for 3 days. Ladies and gentlemen, may I present Duncan McGibbon.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dipali.
I better go and look after the online people.
Yes. In this talk, I want first to outline the life and work of Robert Southwell, who lived from 1561 to 1595. He is less well known as Shakespeare. 1564 to 1616, his junior by 3 years. So about 2/3 of what I'm going to say is about Southwell. The other is about Shakespeare. I assume you know your Shakespeare, but I have a suspicion that not everybody knows their Southwell. So I hope it'll be enlightening tonight. I then want to argue for the influence of Southwell on Shakespeare, held by critics such as Devlin, rather than the more well-held view that critics such as Lawrence hold that in fact Shakespeare influenced Southwell. You may well ask, what's the point of establishing a connection between a dramatist and a saint? There's no need now to promote the saint by means of the genius. There was a tendency, especially when I was young, to be saying, well, Southwell's poetry must be good because after all, he knew Shakespeare, which is a completely convoluted argument, the whole point being that if there is a genuine influence, it can be tracked down. Southwell, of course, is now his own man. There are 2 collected editions available. I don't know whether they're still in print, but the transition from the spiritual to physical passion tells us a lot about how Shakespeare actualized human emotion in his plays and poems. The key word there, I think, is passion. So first of all, then, St. Robert Southwell, priest, Jesuit, writer, poet, and martyr, was born into what was for the few a rural paradise before the end of 1561, the 3rd and youngest son of Richard Southwell, who is called in the Dictionary of National Biography a gentleman and courtier of Horsham St. Faith, Norfolk, and Bridget Coakley, whose grandmother, in fact, was a Shelley. What I have called paradise was the estate of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Faith to the north of Norwich. As one of the visitors for the suppression of the monasteries in Norfolk, Sir Richard kept properties for himself. Among them was the priory with its farms assigned to him outright in 1545. And from his immense wealth, Sir Richard provided for his children, 2 of whom became lawyers. The Southwells formed part of a network of wealthy, interrelated families that included the Rusleys, the Howards, the Bacons and the Settles, as well as the more recusant families such as Vaux, Arden and Copley. And he was related to Shakespeare. That, by the way, is Robert's father. And here is the genealogy. Now, make it clear, I'm not saying that merely because they were cousins, that there's anything of a literary argument in that. We all of us have famous cousins, but nonetheless, they wouldn't have influenced us particularly. I don't think I can make it any bigger, but if you see there, the interesting thing is the involvement of the Shelley family, who were at that time part of a network of wealthy families who were, I would say, anomalously Catholics and then Protestants, many of them leaving in their last wills and testaments that in fact they were Catholics. But nonetheless, they all knew each other. And I don't think there's any doubt that at some stage they would have met, but probably in their childhood. The first problem in Robert's life was to pull himself away from the easy shadow Catholicism of privilege. Queen Elizabeth's secret hope was that the Marian generation would die out before challenging the Protestant establishment. As such, she left the country families alone. Yet it was the men of the younger generations, inspired by martyrs, whom he learnt to respect and whose image Southwell must have seen in his own parish church. The parish church is the parish church of St. Faith, and in, I think, the 50s and 60s, these wall paintings were discovered. Now, they would have been visible wall paintings to the young Southwell. He would have seen them. So I can imagine that Southwell and his mother standing in front of that, because obviously it was there to be venerated. When Southwell returned to England as a mission priest, he spoke of his pain at being unable to visit his father. His mother had died, so that banishing myself from the scent of my cradle in mine own country, I have lived like a foreigner, finding among strangers that which in my nearest blood I presume not to seek. He also reminded his father that even from my infancy, you were wont in merriment to call me Father R, which is the customary style now allotted to my present estate. Robert may also have stayed with other recusant families, such as the Copley house at Gatton, which is quite considerable, but it also shows you what an estate they had as well, while Sir Thomas was away in exile because he was beginning to trouble the authorities. In a poem, Scorn Not the Meek, he describes a typical rural scene. While pike doth rage, the seely tench doth fly, and crouch in privy creeks with smaller fish, yet pikes are caught when little fish go by. These fleet afloat while those do fill the dish. There is a time even for the worm to creep and suck the dew while all her foes do sleep. The merlin cannot ever soar on high, nor greedy greyhound still pursue the chase. The tender lark will find a time to fly, and fearful hare to run a quiet race. He that high growth on cedars did dispow, gave also lowly mushrooms leave to grow. This leads me to believe that he was possibly an angler, but he certainly was a man accustomed to the beauty of nature. But other sources reveal that probably he didn't like hunting. His father, I think, had a license to hunt deer, as Robert's mother had been an attendant on Elizabeth in her childhood. In a letter to Garnet, much later, he asks advice about the hunting and shooting set he had to conceal himself among. He even asked advice as to riding a horse. Robert would have had a happy childhood, but he may have had a dreamy personality. He once got entangled with gypsies who tried almost successfully to kidnap him. His early education would have been given by the tutors attached to these families, such as the one retained by Sir Thomas Peter in Essex. It's also possible that he might have mingled with the Shakespeares, though there's a definite difference between what you could call the middle-class family, very successful family of Shakespeare, and the aristocratic family into which Southwell was born. In 1576, Robert Southwell sailed probably from Great Yarmouth out on the long journey that he took to consecrate it in spiritual maturity. He must have found the journey exhilarating, and in his later writing, he, quite frankly, astonishes us as well. This is him writing about the nature of a sea journey. As the ship, while it is upon the main sea, is in a manner a castle or commonwealth by itself, and having all the sails hoised up and swollen with the wind, and the banners displayed with very lofty show danceth upon the waves, and allureth every eye to behold the pride thereof. But when it is come into haven, it is straight ransacked by the searcher, forced to pay custom, and the sails being gathered, the banners taken in, the anchors cast, it lieth quietly at road, and is little regarded. So they, that while they sailed upon the surges of worldly vanities, and followed the tide of a consciousness, of a conscienceless course, might range uncontrolled, and having the favourable gale of authority to waft them forward, and honours and pomps to set them forth, were admired of the people. If they chance by God's calling to retire themselves unto the port of true faith and virtuous life to work their salutation, they are straight searched and sacked, their sails gathered, the accustomed wind set, their glory disgraced, and they are little or nothing esteemed. I don't think anybody could have written like that about a sailing ship in Elizabethan times without actually having travelled on one. And I think that this very vivid account testifies to that. He was accompanied by John Cotton, who's also on the map. See if I can retrieve him. John Cotton, you see there, he's in line with Shakespeare's Southwell, right? Obviously, and it's a remarkable thing, obviously, Southwell was too young to travel, and therefore he had to have this man accompanying him, who was nonetheless a cousin. So that does provide evidence that, in fact, cousins were accustomed in a time of great suspicion of contacting and playing with each other. But the idea of going was to become a priest, to realize his father's jesting title for him. He was not the first, nor at 15 the very youngest pupil heading for the English college, but remarkably young. Douay, founded by William Allen in the year of Robert's birth, provided the opportunity of what was an impossibility in England and Wales, that of a Catholic education, to salve the consciences of wealthy parents. He would probably have landed at Antwerp, no doubt searched and sacked, and reached the college on the 10th of June. He was admitted to Ankin College, the Jesuit school in Douay, which did not have its own dormitory in the town, so he boarded at the English college. He would have been allowed to roam free for the first days in order to settle in. Douay at that time was one of the first Tridentine seminaries, and Robert was there to become a priest. So Douay taught many laymen. It's still there, by the way, and it is a retreat centre and actually a remarkable building. So if you have a chance to be in the Low Countries, do visit. He would have begun his day at 5 a.m. From 5:40 to 6, there was mental prayer in church. At 6, they were joined by the juniors for litanies and mass. An hour of study was followed by breakfast at 7:30, followed by classes from 8 to 10, then study until noon when they had dinner, and then recreation until 2. Classes followed from 2 till 4. They then studied until 6. Spiritual readings, prayers, and litanies followed until supper at 7. After 7, they were free to roam until 8:30, when after night prayers, examination of conscience, and meditation, they withdrew for the night. This was the standard routine which lasted for hundreds of years in education under penalty in exile in Europe from England. Many returned as laymen, yet this was not Robert's choice, despite the stumbling block of his parents' complete resistance. Many also returned as secular priests, yet Robert resisted that temptation too. He felt his call was for the Jesuits and their mission. In a later letter, Southwell mentions his friend John Deckert, a Flemish student at the school. The letter tells us he first saw him walking with Leonard Lessius. Lessius was only 7 years older than Robert, yet his brilliance had already won him a place at Louvain University through a national competition at the age of 13, which even nowadays would be pretty exceptional. He was then a lecturer at Ankin, and this is the first we know of the contact between this great theologian and Robert Southwell. Lessius was only 7 years old, In 1573, Lessius joined the Jesuits, and after 2 years in the novitiateship, had been sent to Douay to teach philosophy. Writers often make the mistake of assuming Southwell was influenced by Francisco Suarez, the theologian who began as head of the Roman College in Robert's final year. Yet the real influence on Robert was the venerable Leonard Lessius. What was the young Robert taught? As an older boy, with the advantage of home study, he was most likely to have been admitted to the 4th poetry or 5th year rhetoric. Here, under Lessius's scholarship, he studied the poetry of Virgil, including the pastorals and the bucolics and Horace. Under the young Lessius, Robert also read the patristics. Those who meant most to him were Saints Bernard and Bonaventure. Both these saints and St. Thomas, on whom the seminary education was based, agreed that people had a natural desire to see God. Yet Suarez denied it, followed by a whole host, I would say even a dominant host. What's exceptional here is that Lessius, as a very young man, was extremely faithful to Aquinas' teaching about natural desire. In his later entanglements, as a brilliant man, that faded a bit. But at that very moment, I know that what Lessius was teaching Southwell was that God looks at the moral life of people first, and then their predestined place in salvation. Whereas Suarez said God see only their foreordained salvation or damnation. Lessius's advocacy for the role of human freedom in the person's relationship to God chimes with Southwell's avowal of freedom in our relations with God. People still tell me that they're surprised when they read Lessius, mostly only in Latin, as to how modern, in fact, his theology sounds. After only 3 months with this inspiring genius, the school had to evacuate due to a Spanish political insecurity. Southwell was sent to the safety of France, where he was taught in the Collège de Clermont, by Thomas Derbyshire, a Jesuit. Derbyshire had been Chancellor of London under Queen Mary, then sent by Elizabeth to ask the Council of Trent if Catholics could take part in Protestant services, and on receiving a negative reply, was briefly imprisoned before taking up posts in Europe. Derbyshire helped focus Southern on his mission to convert England. Robert went back to Lessius in Douay on the 15th of June, 1577, to leave again with Deckers early in 1578, walking to Rome with the intention of joining the Society of Jesus. Yet another stumbling block to his call took place. Deckard went to Naples to begin his novitiate, yet Robert was denied entry. In his prose, Querimonia, Southwell revealed his hurt. How can I but waste in anguish and agony that find myself disjoined from that company, severed from that society, disunited from that body, wherein lieth all my life, my love, my whole heart and affection. His plea was heard, and he was admitted to the probation house of St. Andrea on the 17th of October, 1758, when he was almost 17. This is not the celebrated Baroque college, but a more austere building. He spent 2 years of his novitiate in meditation and devotion. Southwell wrote a series of personal meditations, Exercitia et Devotiones, which tell of his formation through the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, a saint, of course, shared by the later Gerard Manley Hopkins. The writings from St. Andrea go through the usual self-examination processes. He completed his novitiate and took his vows, and on the 18th of October, 1530, he then went to, 1580, he then went to the Jesuit college in Rome, which at that time was expanding beyond its older buildings. It was very difficult to get a picture of what it would have looked like in his time, but this, of course, is the much more glorified building. A new block of apartments was given to the order and was used by them until 1584, when classes began in the remodeled building. During that time, Robert lodged with the Venerabile English College, which, no, sorry, that's wrong. In the Venerable. Never mind. That, I think, is the Venerabile. This time, Robert and his friends came to love the gardens of the new Jesuit college being laid out at this time. In Flowers of Heaven, he writes, "Grass not on worldly withered weed, it fitteth not thy taste. The flowers of everlasting spring do grow for thy repast. Their leaves are stained in beauty's dye, and blazed with their beams, that stalks enamelled with delight, and limbed with glorious gleams. Life-giving juice of living love their sugared veins doth fill, and watered with eternal showers, they nectared drops distill. These flowers do spring from fertile soil, though from unmanured field, most glittering gold on lieu of glebe, these fragrant flowers doth yield. Whose sovereign sense surpassing sense so ravishes the mind, that worldly weeds needs must he loathe, that he can these flowers find." Southwell completed his philosophy in 1584 and was admitted as a Bachelor of Arts. His ordination took place in the same year, and Father Southwell went on in 1584 to become repitor or tutor at the English College for 2 years, and finally made prefect of studies. Both appointments demanded much from Robert as a counsellor and a manager, despite the formal rigor of studies. Since 1580, he had been secretary to the rector of the English College, Alphonsus Agazzari, and wrote many newsletters to the society. So basically, he rose extremely quickly, evidence that he was a remarkably talented person. Tensions had risen between the Jesuits and the secular clergy at the English College over the former's alleged preferential treatment of their own. The Jesuit mission was also judged by some not to be the only way to convert England. Robert had not involved himself in the dispute, but he found it contributed to low morale. This allowed Southwell to overcome his last stumbling block, the hesitation over his mission. As a prefect of studies, he wrote to Claudio Acquaviva, general of the society, about these tensions, ending the letter with a request that he should be allowed to serve on the English mission. "In the same way as your paternity approves of my present work among the English, so by the inspiration of God, may you also approve of my service in England itself, with the highest hope of martyrdom." Henry Garnet and Robert Southwell rode out of Rome on the 8th of March. At first, they visited Loreto, the shrine of Our Lady, which Saints Ignatius and Francis Xavier had visited before their mission. They may have had a motive to avoid a direct route to Boulogne, as spies were everywhere, and Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was most likely awaiting their arrival. They may have gone via the Alps and seen a landscape similar to that described by Southwell in A Vale of Tears. A vale there is, enwrapped with dreadful shades, which thick of mounting pines shrouds from the sun, where hanging cliffs yield short and dumpish glades, and snowy flood with broken streams doth run, where eye-room is from rock to cloudy sky, from thence to dales with stony ruins strewed, then to the crushed waters frothy fry, which tumbleth from the tops where snow is thawed, where ears of other sound can have no choice, but various blustering of the stubborn wind, in trees, in caves, in straits, with divers noise, which now doth hith, doth howl, doth roar by kind, where waters wrestle with encountering stones that break their streams and turns them into foam, the hollow clouds full fraught with thundering groans, with hideous thumps discharge their pregnant womb. And in the horror of this fearful choir consists the music of this doleful place. All pleasant birds from thence their tunes retire, where none but heavy notes have my grace. Resort there is of none but pilgrim wights, that pass with trembling foot and panting heart, with terror cast in cold and shivering frights, they judge the place to terror, framed by art. Yet nature's work it is, of art untouched, so straight indeed, so vast unto the eye, with such disordered order strangely couched, and with such pleasing horror, low and high, that who it views must needs remain aghast, much at the work, more at the maker's might, and muse how nature such a plot could cast, where nothing seemeth wrong, yet nothing right. A place for mated minds, an only bower, where everything do soothe a dumpish mood. Earth lies forlorn, the cloudy sky doth lower, the wind here weeps, here sighs, here cries aloud. The struggling flood beneath the marble groans, then roaring heats upon the scraggy sides, a little off amidst the pebble stones. With bubbling streams and purling noise it glides. The pines thick set, high grown and evergreen, still clothe the place with sad and mourning veil. Here gaping cliff, there mossy plain is seen. Here hope doth spring, and there again doth quail. Huge massy stones that hang by tickle stays, still threaten fall, and seem to hang in fear, where with some withered trees, ashamed of their decays, bereft of green, are forced grey coats to wear. Here crystal springs, crept out of secret vein, straight find some envious hole that hides their grace. Here serried tufts lament the want of rain, there thunder rat gives terror to the place. All pangs and heavy passions here may find 1,000 motives suiting to their griefs, to feed the sorrows of their troubled mind, and chase away Dame Pleasure's vain reliefs. To plaining thoughts this vale a rest may be, to which from worldly joys they may retire, when sorrow springs from water, stone and tree, where everything with mourners doth conspire. I think that gives you the flavor of what's most important in Southwell. He was able to combine a complete love of nature with a complete awareness that it's not all. In letters to Agazzari and Acquaviva, they noted their arrival, firstly at Douai and then at the huge other Jesuit foundation in Saint-Omer. One of Southwell's last letters was to Deckers. He wrote from Calais or Boulogne, teamed I Portu for security on the 15th of July. He then crossed to England. Robert Southwell's letter was full of apprehension with the hope of martyrdom. The two priests landed on the south coast near Folkestone. They hid probably at Capel Fernie, separated and made their ways to London. Walsingham seems to have known they had already landed. Robert's first address was probably at Lord Vaux's in Hackney. At some time, he met William Weston, the only active Jesuit priest in England, and travelled with him. It's also likely that he attended cultural meetings under the guise of being a single gentleman. After the outbreak of the Babington plot, with its political aim to put Mary of Guise on the throne, and at least to dispose the excommunicated Elizabeth, Weston was arrested and Garnet succeeded him as superior. Southwell was assigned to the London area and was responsible for priests arriving from the continent before departing to their posts in England. Justice Young, the Middlesex priest hunter, heard from the spy Anthony Tyrrell that a priest called Sane was sheltered in Hackney. On the 5th of November, the house was raided. Southwell hid behind panels for 4 hours. 2 letters signed Robertus were found on Henry Vaux, rumouring that Robert Parsons had returned to England, but Tyrrell knew them to be Southwell's. After his narrow escapes, Southwell's position in London steadied. He was protected by Anne Howard, Countess of Arundel and Surrey. She gave him the use of a house, probably in Spitalfields, where he and Garnet set up printing presses. As you know, that is actually the site of the Savoy, but nonetheless, it was a vast building, and it was an important aspect of the Jesuit mission to produce books and to circulate them. Sheltered in her household, he became her chaplain and her confessor. Here, Southwell wrote many tracts on the theme of pastoral consolation for her and her husband, the future Philip Howard. On the 18th of October, 1591, Southwell published his only political statement. An humble supplication to Her Majesty was a response to Burleigh's work, the proclamation, a declaration of great troubles pretended against the realm by a number of seminary priests and Jesuits. Along with penal orders, the proclamation was an attack on the personal attributes of the young men who went overseas to submit themselves to training for the priesthood. The abusive diatribe from this heavy adversary of our good names brought rebuttal from Southwell. He insists upon the religious nature of their purpose. The whole and only intent of our coming into this realm is no other but to labour for the salvation of souls and in peaceable and quiet sort to confirm them in the ancient Catholic faith. Southwell then went on to rebut the Babington plot, claiming that it was both plotted, furthered and finished by Sir Francis Walsingham and other complices. Queen Elizabeth did not stoop to read Robert's appeal, but it angered Burleigh and it focused attention on Southwell. A year later, on the 20th of September, 1592, he wrote to Archbishop Whitgift of the multitude of slanders dispersed in books against the state and government. Garnet judged the tract too dangerous to publish, but it circulated in manuscript. This intensified persecution. In October 1591, the 2 priests only just escaped arrest in Baddesley Clinton at the house of the 2 daughters of Lord Vaux. The house had become a meeting place for Jesuit priests, and St. Nicholas Owen had constructed hiding holes. It was here the Jesuits met to renew their vows. Robert's description was also circulated, as evinced from a captured fellow priest, John Cecil. In February 1592, Garnet relayed he had taken Southwell's place in London and had been sent into the country. Uxenden was a farmhouse near the confluence of the Kenton and Wheelstone brooks, Harrow. It was bought by William Bellamy, who married Catholic Bellamy. The Bellamy family continued to help Catholic priests as it had done in the past, such as Campion, Parsons, Weston, Wingfield, and Dr. Richard Bristow, the reviser of the Dewey Bible. This is where the Babington conspirators fled. According to Camden, the contemporary topographer, Burleigh noticed men standing about as he rode up the hill from his own house, Theobald's. They said they were looking for conspirators. Such was the atmosphere generated by sensationalism. The Babington plotters, among whom was Jerome Bellamy, were executed at Lincoln's Inn Fields. The Bellamy family was persecuted for having sheltered them. Catherine was sent to the Fleet prison and then to the Tower, where she died of exposure. Her son Jerome was barely implicated, but he was executed with the Babington conspirators. Her next son, Robert, fled to Holland, but was captured and sent to the Tower, where he died. Bartholomew also went to the Tower, where he died. The official explanation was they had hanged themselves. According to Druitt, the hangings concealed deaths on the rack. Thomas, her surviving son, continued to help Catholics. Anne Bellamy, Thomas's eldest sister, had been taken for recusancy, raped and tortured by Richard Topcliffe, the vicious priest hunter, an atrocious psychopath, in Geoffrey Hill's words. The house was raided and Southwell was captured. Southwell refused to give his name or to acknowledge that he was a priest, hoping to give the Bellamys time to escape. He was taken first to Topcliffe's house, where he was tortured, and on the 28th of June, he was sent to the gatehouse nearby. On the 28th of July, through the intervention of his family, he was committed to the Tower. Southwell's solitary confinement lasted 2.5 years. After 8 months in the Tower, he had hoped the Bellamys had had time to vanish. He asked to write to Sir Robert Cecil. The letter, dated the 6th of April, 1593, provided Cecil with the necessary information to bring him to trial. I was the child of a Christian woman and not the whelp of a tiger. I could not fear and foresee and not forewarn. I had not a crueler heart than a damned caitiff to despise their bodies and souls by whom I received mine. But this was an unveiled zeal, a blind and now polished faith, a zeal notwithstanding, and a faith it was, and God Almighty is my witness. I came with no other intention into the realm. Robert admitted his guilt under the Elizabethan laws, but sought mercy. I have here sent you a sharp sword, it as I supposed, well sheathed. The letter was known to Garnet. He sent a vague report of its contents to Aquaviva. Garnet was the Jesuit principal. And Aquaviva received the information in 1595, but Sir Cecil did not reply. Garnet called Robert's 2 years of solitary imprisonment this blessed solitude. His friend, Philip Howard, was kept in the Tower in fear of execution with a dog, which served as a go-between between Robert Southwell, and they could smuggle messages to each other. If you go to, I'll discuss this at the end, because although these two men apparently never met, Howard's dog helped them increase their friendship and deal out encouragement in each other's difficulty. Philip Howard loved his pet, remembered along with him in a statue at Arundel Cathedral. So if you go to Arundel Cathedral, do look at this shrine, because the dog is also there. And it's a really affectionate gesture to this remarkable dog. In February 1595, Southwell was taken to the notorious cell in Newgate called Limbo, and on the 20th, he was brought before the Queen's Bench for trial for treason under the Act of 1585. Sir Edward Coke, Attorney General, conducted the prosecution and directed his attention on the Jesuits' advocacy of equivocation. Southwell was weakened by 10 inflictions of torture he had to endure, and he witnessed many, and he excused any memory lapses as being caused by it. All his answers were scorned by Topcliffe, who had to be restrained several times. In particular, Robert's affirmation that he was the same age as Christ when he died. Anne Bellamy alone gave evidence, saying she had been instructed not to reveal the presence of a priest in the house, an example of equivocation which Southwell would have roundly defended. But he was found guilty and returned to Newgate. I feel very sorry for Anne Bellamy, but and when I can just repeat the same phrase, I think, and that he was an atrocious psychopath. There was nothing that Topcliffe wouldn't do. All his answers were scorned by Topcliffe, who had to be restrained several times. Anne Bellamy alone gave evidence. The next day, 21st of February 1595, he was taken to Tyburn to face the horror of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Throughout his mature life, he had readied himself for such a death, and those who reported his last sufferings spoke of the acceptance he expressed. He quietly returned the greetings of those whose spiritual lives he had protected and strengthened, and threw them his rosary. For the last time, he acknowledged that he was a priest of the Society of Jesus. He prayed for the Queen, for the country, and for his soul, asking that he might find perseverance unto the end of this, my last conflict. That Robert Southwell was a martyr was doubted by no one. This is in the English College. He was regarded with great love by his fellow Jesuits, the people he served, and his superiors. John Gerard, who often travelled with him, spoke of his success in saving souls. He was so wise and good, gentle and lovable. Garnet's letters reveal the distress he felt. In a letter to Rome of 16th July 1592, he spoke of being bound with him in a mystical unity in which all tortures might be endured. Aquaviva expressed his special sorrow. According to the 20th century writer, Philip Caraman, Aquaviva felt a loneliness and grief of mind and heart which never let him. Robert Southwell was an advocate of what Journell called the apostolate of letters. He meant this in 4 ways: his correspondence, his personal meditations, his prose writings, and his poetry. He was a succinct and prompt writer of reports, as his mission required. At times he was partisan. From our ecumenical perspective, referring to a Protestant's remains as crap is jarring. There is no complete edition of his letters, but many are quoted in biographies. We learn nothing more of his personal life from them than the circumstances of secrecy and obedience allowed. The same applies to his meditations on the spiritual exercises. His notes taken down at formative retreats are typical of a young man's desire to conform to his founder's message that the human response to God's unconditional love should be total. Every muscle of freedom should be urged to purge self-satisfaction. These notes are not the write-ups of psychoanalysis. They are not testimony of some unresolved struggle with his faith, but direct obedience to the spiritual exercises. Southwell, in fact, was not a casuist, despite his advocating caution and equivocation rather than betrayal. I mean, if the Nazis came to the door wanting to know if I had Jews hiding in my attic, I would lie. But that's not to say that this a deliberate attempt to undermine truth. So it's not Suarez's casuistry, which denies the force of prescriptive laws by generalizing exceptional circumstances. It was condemned by the magisterium in 1679 by Pope Innocent XI as propositionem laxorum moralis darum. In other words, he directly accused the nonetheless extremely influential Suarez of undermining truth. The exercises plead the strengthening of faith against the crucified Christ, not begging salvation from an executioner. Southwell lived in a time of apostasy. As an educated man, every move he made risked compromise. Another false assertion about the influence of Ignatius and Southwell lies in the view that the exercise allowed the I, the first person of the verb, to be the first person in the world. On the contrary, the exercises want the person to contemplate Jesus in the Gospels, in his humble babyhood, and in his message to me and us. The pronoun us sums up what Ignatius wants. According to the Catholic faith, we choose to follow Jesus in poverty of spirit, self-emptying, and in a humility only possible through rejecting greed, honors, and pride. Another misunderstanding of the Catholic Ignatian way is to omit the appeal to practical decision-making. Neither Southwell nor Ignatius was a Neoplatonist. Ignatius makes this clear when he speaks of the positive doctors, i.e. the patristics, rather than the recents, such as the scholastics and Suarez. To praise positive and scholastic learning is good, as it is more proper to move the heart to love. When Ignatius told Southwell to move his heart to love, a realist spoke to a realist about a practical decision to live one's life with and for Christ in service. Another slip which literary critics make is to place too much emphasis on the contrast between Neoplatonic innerness and outerness of the soul and its upper and lower reaches. Access to the soul as God's vision of perfection is not through subjectivity, but action, as Ignatius and Southwell professed. Actions alone, according to Ignatius, can gain the vision of God. But only actions alone cannot gain the vision of God, but only actions combined with the grace of God, which we cannot woo out of the clouds. This is the devotional and sacramental way of Southwell. The Eucharist was the center of his spirituality, and of course was never a metaphor. But according to Southwell, the human awareness of God should be positive, and yet to use a modern expression, it should apperceive the sinful self within the human condition of sin. Against Calvin's legalism, guilt and fear can be overcome through conversion from individual sin and knowing oneself to be totally forgiven in terms of a personal relationship with Christ. It is the way of union with Christ, uniting with his passion to carry out his mission with strength, with a more profound sorrow for one's sins and a greater compassion and for God's suffering people. Southwell, following his Catholic belief in his personal writings, often laments his own sin, but it is not the cry of a broken spirit, but the affirmation of the hope of redemption. Southwell lived his life in the joy of the Lord, making a total response to God's love in contemplation on God's love, in response to God's gifts. Most of his English writings were composed between his return to England in 1586 and his arrest in 1592. His first full-length composition, An Epistle of Comfort to the Reverend Priests, began as a series of letters written to the jailed Earl of Arundel. An epistle to his father, written in 1589, offered comfort to those persecuted for their belief and castigated their persecutors. The other books that he published were The Triumphs Over Death, A Humble Supplication to Her Majesty, and A Short Rule of the Good Life. We don't yet have a collected edition of Southwell's prose. Southwell's poems are responsible to the circumstances of his times, expressed in the convention of his age. Southwell started writing Latin poetry during his novitiate, or possibly even earlier, under Lassius. Southwell lived in the age of the Baroque, named the emblem of a misshapen pearl. In Renaissance and Baroque, Wölfflin identified the Baroque as movement imported into mass, the dreaming saints on irregular balanced clouds, the sound pictures of Bach, choral preludes, the architecture of Borromini, the theatrical squares of cities, and the poetry of Quevedo and Marino, all displayed the same style, well summed up by Wölfflin. Robert Southwell, the writer, was bound up in this. He was very much aware of writing that was going on in English around him. He uses what we would call exaggerated metaphors and comparisons, and prefers, especially in his prose, florid gestures, importing movement into the mass of devotional tradition. Southwell made two attempts to translate a medieval homily, then attributed to Origen, known as Adivimus Mariani, from its first words in English. Southwell translated about 2/3 of the sermon, using it as an exercise to regain fluency in English. There's quite a debate about the fact that Southwell, who had been talking Italian for a considerable number of years, found it rather difficult to break into writing in English again. In Mary Magdalene's Funeral Tears, Southwell presents an elaborate and ornate style of consolation for the unconsolable. It is in typical Baroque style, but it is aimed at the people of England from whom the practice of faith has been taken away. They too are inconsolable, yet consolation can be offered. Southwell repeats over and over again the mourning of Mary Magdalene, as if the specification of Mary's desire to see Christ in its full emotional term is itself a consolation. Desire to see Christ above all, and you will be consoled, seems to be Southwell's message. This is the clue to Southwell's entire vision. England, from whom the practice of faith had been taken away, is used very much by critics, but there's something even more interior to Southwell's account of passion. If you read through the account of passion in the collected poems, you become aware of the fact that although he was, you could say, an exceptional man following a very narrow path, nonetheless, the intensity of his account of desire is quite remarkable. The book Mary Magdalene's Tears was very popular, first printed while its author was in prison, then it ran through 9 English and 2 continental editions within 32 years. It was widely imitated in prose and verse. Thomas Lodge, Nicholas Breton, I'm claiming William Shakespeare, and Gervase Markham all, in fact, showed the influence of his writing. It ushered into English literature a tradition that lasted as late as Richard Brayshaw's The Weeper. 3 critics of stature have spoken about Southwell's poetry. Ben Jonson told Drummond of Hawthornden, Southwell was hanged, yet he had written of that piece of his, The Burning Babe, then he would be prompt to destroy many of his. Jonson never suffered fools. It's a major commendation. C.S. Lewis, like Jonson, an Anglican, saw a remarkable continuity between medieval and Baroque poetry, but also said Southwell modestly but firmly refused to take any notice as a poet of the period in which he was living, which I think is untrue. The other great poet who affirmed Southwell's ability was Geoffrey Hill, who quoted the older poets, loves I allow and passions I approve, as an epithet in the first line of Pavana Dolorosa, a poem which is extremely beautiful and wonderfully crafted, but still makes Southwell to be some kind of obsessed fanatic. This is hardly redeemed by his view that his poetry is expressive of courage, when what matters is what Southwell, like Wilfred Owen, was being courageous about. Scholars had difficulty in dating his poetry, while the dates of his prose works are reasonably clear. Apart from his Latin poetry, most seems to have been written while Southwell was chaplain to Anne Howard, Countess of Arundel. And some during his imprisonment. None of his poems were published until after his martyrdom. They were most likely gathered from manuscripts by John Gerard. Once published by Woolf, they were bestsellers in Elizabethan terms, reprinted the same year, 1593. Further editions followed in year after year until it ran into sand, and the first complete edition appeared in 1872, and the most recent edition is 2007. The poems are not easy to read, but they can be rewarding, so long as you can accept the conventions of his times and their intense summons to devotion. Southwell wrote 6 genres of poetry: dramatic monologues, lyrics of consolation, poems of the incarnation, elegiac complaints, Marian devotions, and Eucharistic prayers. His dramatic monologues take figures such as David, Joseph, Mary, St. Peter, and Mary Magdalene, and concentrate on the spirituality of the condition of disaster, sorrow, and the desire for God combined in deep emotion. If you look at each of these figures, David denying his God and sending a husband to his death in order to marry his wife, Joseph not believing Mary, St. Peter denying Christ, etc. What Southwell wants to convey is the utter loneliness and agony of the person, while at the same time insisting upon his intense desire for God. So these two are 2 very remarkable forces in his poetry. It may be narrow, It may not be very well known, but it is remarkable. So these dramatic monologues try to show how forgiveness is open to those who are honest about how they feel. They are intense, but in the longer poems, rather repetitive. But that very repetitiveness begins to work on you. It's a very long, St. Peter's Tears is a very long poem, but nonetheless, if you stick with it, you become aware of its intensity. The next genre, the lyrics of consolation, followed the conventions of Baroque love lyrics, addressed to the beloved under the euphemism of the soul. The model Southwell followed cannot be traced with any certainty. His technique is close to Nicholas Breton. His rhetoric is taken from continental Europe. We know he satirized Sir Edward Dyer, the poet and diplomat, whom he may have met in the Netherlands. What is absent in these secular models of other poets is any sense of desire. You can hunt through Elizabethan verse, and you do not find desire being used in any other way except either as erotic desire or as a kind of Neoplatonic ascending through the spheres. What's remarkable again about Southwell is that he is completely realistic in his descriptions of these states. Souls ascend, withdraw, are accompanied, but never want in the verse of his contemporaries. What Southwell did was to insert the soul's natural desire for God into these love conventions. In every lyric, consolation comes from desiring God and yet dependence on him to fulfill it as only he can forgive our sinfulness. Here is an example. Look home. Retired thoughts enjoy their own delights, as beauty doth in self-beholding eye. Man's mind a mirror is of heavenly sights, a brief wherein all marvels summon lie. Of fairest forms and sweetest shapes the store, most graceful all, yet though may grace them more. The mind a creature is, yet can create to nature's patterns, adding higher skill of finest works, better could the state. If force of wit had equal power of will, device of man in working has no end. What thought can think, another thought can mend. Man's soul of endless beauty images, drawn by the work of endless skill and might. This skillful might give many sparks of bliss, and to discern this bliss a native light. To frame God's image as his worths required, his might, his skill, his word and will conspired. All that he had his image should present. All that it should present, it should afford. To that he could afford, his will was bent. His will was followed with a performing word. Let this suffice, by this conceive the rest. He should, he could, he would, he did the best. Typically, each line is in iambic meter. There are 6 lines to each stanza, rhyming A, B, A, C, C, and I'll return to this later. He uses a lot of alliteration, such as forms and sweetest shapes that store, voweling and puns. In the words of Hans Urs von Balthasar, a theologian, on St. Gregory of Nyssa, even as it thinks and imagines alone, the mind as highest faculty mirrors the soul and conceives perfections. Yet the mind as a craftsperson forges works of the imagination, which are natural processes. Art embellishes the soul, seeks to refresh it in its highest values. The artist does his best. After witnessing God's presence, Moses, for example, continued his seeking in Gregory's as if a lover. Southwell refers to Gregory in an epistle of comfort. The importance of this, again, is this idea of the natural desire for God, which was completely denied by the church for a very, very long time. And what we're getting in Southwell is a glimpse of a theology that could have been. The journey towards salvation is marked by a successive elimination of all that we have in order to reach what we are. The safest path and surest refuge is not to be deluded and fail to recognize ourselves, who we truly are. We should not believe that we are seeing ourselves when we are only seeing something that surrounds us. Our body, our senses, the ideas of other some of us. This is very close to St. Bernard. It is not as if grace did half the work and free choice the other half, but each does the whole work according to its own contribution. Grace does the whole work, and so does free choice, but with this qualification: the whole work is done in free choice, but the whole work is done in grace. That, I think, would sum up Southwell's moral preoccupation and his preoccupation with action. In a sense, it's impossible to divorce his mission from his writing, and he himself, I think, regarded his poetry too as being part of that mission, which some may find very difficult. Southwell's greatest poem, and one of the greatest poems in the English language, is The Burning Babe. As I in hoary winter's night stood shivering in the snow, surprised I was with sudden heat, which made my heart to glow. And lifting up a fearful eye to view what fire was near, a pretty babe all burning bright did in the air appear, who scorched with excessive heat such floods of tears did shed, as though his floods should quench his flames, which with his tears were bred. Alas, quoth he, but newly born in fiery heats I fry, yet none approach to warm their hearts or feel my fire but I. My faultless breast the furnace is, the fuel wounding fawns. Love is the fire and sighs the smoke, the ashes shames and scorns. The fuel justice layeth on, and mercy blows the coals. The metal in this furnace wrought are men's defiled souls, for which as now on fire I am, to work them in their good. So will I melt into a bath to wash them into my blood. With this he vanished out of sight and swiftly shrunk away, and straight I called unto my mind that this was Christmas Day. Yet critics fall over each other trying to understand it. Most grant its visionary power and the detachment of its narrator, but they miss the central point. Christ the man has a natural desire for God, as Aquinas in the patristic state. He overheats because his desire is absorbed by himself. God loves himself as only a perfect love can. We cannot love God in the Catholic tradition or other traditions without the love of self getting in the way. To do so entails a path of suffering. This is why God loves us, because he loves himself, and thus because he is love. The narrator symbolizes fallen humanity, frozen in its self-deceiving snow. The incarnation is a completely gratuitous event, fearful and sudden. The baby's tears are bred by the fire, not raised to quench it, though it might appear that way. None may appear to help because no one can see God's face to face without dying to the self. Christ's divine innocence raises his natural desire to its highest fulfillment. The baby's love causes him to cry to fallen humanity, allegorical figures of mercy and justice, tend the furnace of people's molten souls. Only at the end does the baby refer to his future sacrifice as cooling blood. The reference to thorns is to the imperfect souls which offend his love. The poem is about the work of atonement from God's point of view. In every age, the poem seems new, yet it reflects the medieval trope from St. Bernard of the Virgin Mary as the burning bush transferred to her child, a fire that blazes and does not consume. Southwell the man, Southwell the poet, and Southwell the martyr are difficult to reconcile. Southwell the man loved nature and action, yet preached passive renunciation of the world. Southwell the poet used the structure of love poems to preach the desire for and the love of God. Southwell the martyr was regarded as a fanatic, even by some Jesuits. Yet what corrects these contradictions is the courage to love nature and love God, and so to allow no one to bar the way to his ultimate desire to see God. In his essence, a vow he kept as a perfect example of a Jesuit and a martyr. So in the first part of this talk, I hope I've given a comprehensive account of Southwell under his many personae. I apologize if people are very familiar with Southwell, in which case, of course, you would have heard this before. But for those who don't know his verse, I've just hoped that I've given you an example of it. I repeat that my aim is to argue for the influence of the Jesuit on the playwright in both style and theme. It's not solely an exercise in literary history, but a new approach to Shakespeare's actualization of passion. Some, such as Janel, would imply you cannot connect cousins for literary influence. There's no real evidence, so why compare apples and oranges merely because they're fruits? However, although we have no indication of when any of the priest's poems were written, as printed by Wolfe's best-selling edition of Southwell in 1595, other publishers brought out further expanded editions, as I've already said. But of course, they all left out reference to Catholic belief. Not having a chronological order is a major stumbling block in our interpretation of the poet. But the main tradition for a relation between the poets stems from Grosart's 1872 edition, which brought Southwell's verse from the obscurity of Tudor publishing, anthologies, and secret manuscripts to the 20th century, where I'm sure it stood on Father Gerard Manley Hopkins' shelf. It is his position I want to defend. During the time, of course, the Burning Babe continued to be in just about every anthology. In turn, the claim that if there was a relationship, it was one of Southwell in 1592, reading the yet unpublished Venus and Adonis of his cousin, which was printed and published in 1593. In their view, Southwell reacted to the sensuality of the poem in the Textus Criticus of the whole debate, his author to the reader, which prefaces Southwell's St. Peter's complaint. Christ's thorn is sharp, no head his garland wears, still finest wits are still in Venus rose. The phrase Venus rose is taken by many as a reference to Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and a reproof to its eroticism. It is incongruous to assume Jesuits with their lives at stake and committed to preaching, worship, and religious controversy would have a secret copy of an erotic poem on their knees, cousin or no cousin. Now, Wilson in Secret Shakespeare claims Shakespeare's poem circulated in manuscript, yet the complete consensus of editors of Shakespeare's poems concludes the poem was written in February or May 1693, when the theatres were closed in an outbreak of plague. Shakespeare was already a practiced man of the theatre, and he knew how to write clean copies of script and write at speed. By this time, Southwell was already in prison and not allowed books. So in this, I agree with Klaus that Shakespeare's poem was an impossible read for Southwell. So Shakespeare did not know Venus and Adonis. Yet there are other contexts for Venus Rose. Jason Lawrence brings much scholarship to bear on the view that the young Southwell in Rome, learning to be fluent in Italian, interacted with its literary culture sufficiently to be aware of poets such as Tasso and Tansilo, stretching back to Petrarch. Southwell's poems certainly show the influence of Petrarchan patterns. As I mentioned earlier, he studied Ovid and Virgil under the exacting Lysias. The evidence of the young Southwell's translation certainly shows this. The Elizabethan age was an age of translations, most of which, such as Chapman, were published later than Venus and Adonis. By date, Golding's Ovid was at Shakespeare's fingertips. Harrington's Tasso is compatible by style, but not date. Southwell's most extensive poem, St. Peter's Complaint, stems from an incomplete translation of the Italian poet Tranzio's La Lagrime di San Pietro, which was printed in 1560 and later set to music by Orlando di Lasso. A clear biographical track can be found in following all the different accounts of St. Peter. There's also certain passages which Southwell translated from Italian poetry, which shows that he used Baroque models, but did so in a very different way. Southwell's meaning is always very different. It's the traditional Pauline precept of living life to the full in the Lord while we live in the world. He does not want to put fig leaves over Tasso's sensual rose, but to recast its teleology, its greater aim. Could this be the Venus rose Southwell is referring to in the author to his reader? Lawrence uses this evidence to show by implication that neither poet influenced or was influenced by the other. Both were part of the general literary scene in England, with poets such as Sidney, Spenser, Watson, and Daniel all focusing on Tasso as a model. However, no matter how meticulous the evidence, the fact that Shakespeare and Southwell engaged in the same literary ethos does not show nor rule out they influenced each other. A starting point can be found in that both Venus and Adonis and St. Peter's Complaint have the same meter. They both used, as I said before, the 6-line sonnet-like lyric stanza, which is much shorter, A, B, A, B, C, C. Both standards divide more distinctly into a quatrain and a couplet. In Italian, the form is known as the sesta. This is often the case with other poets, using the same scheme, such as the anonymous lyric writers of Bird's, Wilkes and Jones's songs. Other poets, such as Watson, Peel, De Vere, Hayward, Green, Gascoigne, and Dyer, who were certainly known to Southwell, Breton, Lodge, and Barnfield, wrote in it before it was used by Shakespeare, yet none of them uses the meter for extended narrative, only Southwell and Shakespeare. Southwell simplifying and imitating Tassilo, and Shakespeare imitating Southwell. Of course, stylistic evidence is not enough to confirm the influence of Southwell on Venus and Adonis. The circumstances of Southwell's role as a confessor to Lady Howard and to the Earl of Southampton bring Shakespeare's dedicatee in the Jesuit much closer. Southwell's complaint circulated in manuscript and might have been extended among Catholic circles. Shakespeare could have stayed in London with the Earl and encountered Southwell there. He could have read Southwell's complaint in manuscript, the dedication of Venus and Adonis to the Earl of Southampton reflects this. Other clues can be brought in, such as Southwell's letters to his good cousin, in which he reiterates the priest's challenge to poets, making so light of love that they make liars of love and poetry. That passion should be folly is anathema to Southwell, who, as I said earlier, had a belief in freedom in making moral choices and the role of the desire for God in pursuing that freedom. An edition published in 1616 of this letter to his good cousin was republished by the Plantin Press, and it substituted letter to the good cousin to Mr. W.S., which of course was the year in which Shakespeare died. So it's possible that could be put forward as evidence. But for me, the most important thing that matters is St. Peter's denial and anguish over the effects of his own choice, Mary Magdalene's regret over her past sensuality, David's sorrow for his misdeeds, Joseph's grief over accusing Mary of adultery, and the apostles sleeping despite their suffering, are all expressions of extreme and passionate sorrow. It would be a mistake to think that poems such as these are inspired by the dire situation of Catholicism at that time. The martyr's meaning extends to the main tradition of Christianity. They offer consolation to all. After the poems were first brought out by his publisher, they continued to be printed and sold successfully. So it's a mistake to think that it was just Catholics who were buying this verse. It was being bought by all Christians, apart perhaps from Puritans, who would not have been in favor of the sources of Southwell's verse. Another misinterpretation that critics like to assume is that he deliberately pulled off the label of God and pulled off the label of eroticism and substituted the label for the love of God. His project was much more complex than that. He describes it as being to weave a new web in their own loom. What Southwell wanted was a recognition of the seriousness of passion and not its exclusive relegation to sexual desire. Humanity, from Lessius' Aquinas, has a natural desire for God. That is what the saint means when he criticizes contemporaries for their idle fancies that ignore serious human passion. Passionate humanity thrusts against its limitations. Frustrated passion is close to divine passion than mere toys or amusement. This was what attracted Shakespeare's attention. Throughout Venus and Adonis, the frustrated passion of a goddess is explored and expressed in a rhetoric of sensuality. Love comforteth, like sunshine after rain, but lust's effect is tempest after sun. Love's gentle spring doth always fresh remain. Lust winter comes ere summer half be done. Love surfeits not, lust like a glutton dies. Love is all truth, lust full of forged lies. And now I'm going to read another one. How can I live that thus my life denied? What can I hope that lost my hope in fear? What trust in one that truth itself defied? What good in him that did his God forswear? O sin of sins, O ills the very worst, O matchless wretch, O caitiff, most accurred. Which of the two of those is Shakespeare? The first or the second? The first is Shakespeare, but you do see how close Southwell's language is. So Shakespeare has found a direct expression of physical passion and given it an extreme dimension. Southwell focuses on people in spiritual extremes and expresses the passion of their situation. The language of introspection, of extended grief and frustration, can only be found in these two poems. I cannot read all of the 2,445 poems written in sesta rima, which Scott Bauman and Burton found in their search between 1476 and 1603. But most surviving poems written by others, such as Breton, Dyer, Haywood, Green, Fulke Greville, seem lightweight. Fairfax and Carew concentrate on erotic descriptions, but they do translate the beloved as a rose. They could be the fairest wits the priest referred to. That year saw both the death of Southwell and the publication of Venus and Adonis. Shakespeare's poem, which was published and republished, revolutionized Elizabethan poetry so much that the 6-line stanza came to be known as the Venus and Adonis meter, until taken over by Byron and other romantics. To conclude, there is more causal and stylistic evidence of Southwell's influence on Shakespeare than any other contemporary. However, such judgments need to be tempered by the respect in which such influence is meaningful. What is the sense of any influence but to further our understanding of a writer? In Shakespeare's case, it underlines the serious, introspective description of extreme passion. Venus's frustration at the indifferent Adonis and then the dead Adonis is narrated in remarkable detail. Even his two great rivals, Spenser and Sidney, do not rise to the playwright's level of descriptive passion. But to account for emotion in this way was beyond them, despite their superb Platonic style. There's a tendency brought about by what had come to be known as the Whig interpretation of Shakespeare. This began with Hudson and was maintained by Macaulay and Hazlitt, who sought to make Shakespeare's inheritance more respectable, presenting him as an okay guy. This presented Shakespeare as dare I say it, an Anglican standard of morality to Victorian and later readers. What prevented understanding was the subversive nature of Shakespeare's verse and theatre. Shakespeare is dangerous and contradictory, capable of translating spiritual passion into sexual passion. This is his fascination. Thank you. Okay, so basically it's an introduction to Southwell, but also to make a very controversial point, and that is that Shakespeare, aware but having to keep it secret of his cousin's death, nonetheless was influenced. And in a series of lectures, if I can give them, some other plays, such as the early plays, Titus Andronicus, for example, with its description of the passion and the extremism and the different of its characters is quite. But Are there any questions? Anything you want to know about Southwell? Sorry.
So all that's left for me to do, sorry, hello. I think all that's left for me to do, Duncan, is to thank you for a very interesting talk and for showing me what a wonderful craftsman Southwell was. You know, his poems are, you know, resonate in their passion. The passion resonates. But there are no questions in the audience, are there? May I ask a question?
Yes.
And that is that with his passion and his craftsmanship and involvement with what was happening currently, I'm just wondering why he was never as popular as his other contemporaries.
Well, Southwell was a recusant Catholic poet and a martyr.
Sorry?
Southwell, we were talking about, so he was a recusant Catholic poet and a martyr, which means that he didn't belong to the main tradition of English verse, which was largely Platonic and quite sensuous and erotic. And therefore, in a way, by driving his way through a very narrow passage, he created a language which is exceptional, but at the same time doesn't really belong. So this is, but I mean, what's remarkable is the way in which in just about every anthology you can think of, the Burning Babe is there. So there must have been some understanding, but he went out of print, I think, chiefly because there was a time, I think, when recusants weren't popular and were ignored. But I also think that revival of interest was very scattered. And when Pope Paul VI canonized him, I think the recognition began to grow. But to begin with, it was, you know, let's push up Southwell's greatness by linking him with Shakespeare. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is Southwell's unique account of passion was influenced by Shakespeare because he knew a good thing when he could see it.
The other interesting thing I found was his definition of love, which is another big subject, I think, but we're short of time. So,
well, I deliberately tried to interpolate the fact that this was very much the inheritance of a very great theologian, Lessius, who influenced him. If you can think of these two young, one a lecturer, one a pupil, that was the cauldron. But it's the idea that passion can be played with, passion can be an erotic toy. That's what he was opposed to.
Yeah, all the many aspects of that energy, if you like. So may I just thank you again, Duncan, for a very interesting talk and one that involved a lot of passion as well from me. So may we put our hands together again for Duncan, please.